Good morning. I made you a promise, and I'm going to keep it. I said we're not going to go through John verse for verse, and some of you are going, but that's what you've been doing up to this point. Intention was to go through the wonderful, the things that really make us, focus on that we might believe. John 20. That's why John wrote the book. And yet this little snippet just before we're going to kind of go for the next several weeks into the miracles that he performs. We're going to look at the other 6. We've already looked at the first one. But I really believe that for me to understand what it meant to follow Jesus, we get an incredible example in the individual that we're going to look at very briefly this morning. Jeff Foxworthy, and I know y'all have heard of him. I'm going to get here. This is what I want to share. If you remember his everybody understands the little famous, you might be a redneck if, okay? I'm going to share a couple with you and then introduce the thoughts. You might be a cook or a bad cook if, and don't take this personally, okay? You look in a cookbook to find out how to boil water. You might be a bad cook if your kids know what exactly peas porridge in a pot 9 days old tastes like. You might be a bad cook when you barbecue, the kids won't come outside, instead they stand at the screen door and watch you. You might be a bad cook if your dog goes to the neighbors to eat. I like that one. And the EPA requires that your garbage cans be marked with a large bright red biohazard symbol. You might be a caffeine addict if you believe that the coffee bean is a vegetable. You might be a caffeine addict if you're on the first name basis with Juan Valdez. Some of you that won't mean anything to. You might be a caffeine addict if you drink decaf by accident and slip into a coma. Or if you regard the fact that your hands are shaking as a good sign. You might be a caffeine addict. You might be a servant of the Lord if. What would you finish that particular phrase with? I want to suggest that we're going to look at an individual this morning that got it. What it really meant to follow Jesus. Now, some of you are going to say afterward, wait a minute, that's not what John did. John was the one that kind of started the whole thing. He got a message from God. We're not sure about the detail of how he received that message. We're not given that. All we're told is that he was given a charge to preach the repentance for the kingdom of God is at hand. And he was told during your preaching, you're going to meet the guy. You're going to get to see the individual that you're setting up. Every group, even in our society, has a setup group. What I've always noticed, now there are rarities in this. You've had this experience, I don't know how many concerts you've been to, but the setup group, the guy or the group or the individuals that come before the main guy aren't as good. Usually. Now, there have been a rare occasion when I wish that the guys that played before had played longer. But normally the individual, and see, John was the setup guy. He was the individual to kind of come and rattle the cage from Judaism into Christianity, and there needed to be a segue. There needed to be a transition. There needed to be someone who kind of caught everybody's attention and said, oh, we're switching gears. That's who John was. And there's a key phrase we're going to get to later, but it's the phrase I want you to think of at first. He must increase. What's that mean? We're given quite a bit of detail when we look at chapter 3, and it was already read by Bryce. I'm going to kind of look back at it, and we're going to move through it. This is really where we're going to stay. Chapter 3, verse 27, it says that John answered, a person cannot receive even one thing unless it is given to him from heaven. Because here's the scenario. John's disciples are with John. In fact, we see them on a number of occasions. Whatever John tells them to do, they do. There's an occasion earlier or later, just before, while John's in prison. It is later. It's while John's in prison. He sends the disciples back to Jesus. And here's the message that John asks. Are you the one that we're supposed to look? Are you the one, or should we look for somebody else? Really cool. Jesus turns, heals a couple of people, turns back around and tells the disciples, go tell John what you saw. John wanted to know that he had accomplished what he'd been sent to do. But that's the key thing that John says, because it would have been really easy when John's disciples came back, because you hear what they're saying, right? The guy you were with over there near the Jordan, he's baptizing individuals, and do you hear the phrase that they say? Everybody's coming to him. Have you ever had anybody try to create jealousy in you before? Now, I'm not talking about that moment, maybe where somebody comes and says, maybe it's your business and you got a competitor, and somebody will walk up and say, hey, they've got a few more guys showing up than you do. The purpose of that is to make us react, to get jealous, to be envious. There's a really, really, really powerful glimpse into John's character here when John simply says, I have a gift from God. I've just got to I got to realize that gift that God has given me is the gift that I'm going to use for God. That's not always as easy as you might think. Because, see, we've got to discover what that is. We were talking in class earlier this morning about the different abilities that we have and being content with the ones God gave us. There is a tendency way too many times to want somebody else's gift, because it's better than the one we have. Or it's different than the one we have. Or it's something that I just wish I could do that. John wasn't going to get caught up in all of this. He was going to simply say, God gave me a responsibility, and I want to do to the best of my ability what God has asked me to do. That's the question I'm going to make this. Are you this morning just simply doing what you're capable of doing, not somebody else? The spirit that John has here is really cool. He says, I don't have to be Jesus. I'm okay with being John. I just want to use the gift that God gave me. That's number one. Number two, he goes over in verse 28. And it's a relationship thing. It's not only a responsibility issue where he's realizing the gift that he has from God. But number two, in verse 28, he makes an observation. And when he says, you yourselves bear me witness that I said, I'm not the Christ, but I have been sent before him. The one who has the bride is the bridegroom, the friend of the bride. See, we got to see ourselves in a relationship with the individual that we're working with. Not only is he using the gift, but he's not the groom. There's a couple of really neat commercials. One of them, a guy gets a letter that he's been chosen to be the best man. That comes with a lot of responsibility. And that's the individual that's supposed to take care of all the particular things so that the groom can just focus on the day. Focus on what's happening, all the celebration and the focus, and make sure that it's just about him and the bride. The best man is the individual who's doing a lot of the work. Some of the responsibility to take care of it. And John says, I'm going to do whatever is necessary to make the day that's coming up the most significant, because it's about him, not me. In our relationship with God, we've been invited to the feast. I remember back in the day when it was kind of a unique experience when we were getting ready for the wedding and everything. I don't know if Pam remembers, but there was a specific individual that I had invited to be my best man. And he was unable to be there. To this day, there have been times even since then he's apologized to me for not making that happen, because at that time he was and still is, one of my best friends in the world. just a lot of different factors are going on. I had a really tough call to make next. Who wants to be the second best man? Right? Now, God's blessed me through the years. There are a multiplicity of individuals around the world that I consider dear friends, but I really, really wrestled with that particular. At that time, I think we did a toss-up, which is just my roommate at the time. But he was still a really good friend. Because there were several other individuals. Had I chosen a particular one, you know what's going to happen, right? Why didn't you pick me? I thought I was your best friend. The guys are not, boy, I'm going to get in trouble here. It was a little easier as a guy than it would have been for Pam changing a maid of honor. I'm just going to say that. It's dynamics, personalities. But what I remember most significantly is every individual that was in our wedding, any one of those guys would have done whatever I'd ask them to do to a person. Am I willing? Is that the kind of relationship? See, John said, God, I know I'm not the guy, but I'm for the guy. And whatever he needs. And that kind of segues into what he says in verse 29. I didn't read all of it when he says, the friend of the bridegroom who stands and hears him rejoices greatly at the bridegroom's voice. Therefore, this joy of mine is now complete. When you get to see the fruition of your goal, see, we live in a world a lot of times that gets caught up in the accolades and the acknowledgments and the awards. And John said, my reward is to see him get what is supposed to be his. When brother meets sorrow, we all feel his grief. When he's passed through the valley, we all feel relief. Together in sorrow, together in rain, together in victory through his precious name. To learn how to celebrate someone else's accomplishments. Not to get caught up in why they weren't mine, not to figure out why was I not a part, but to say, I want to see that Christ is glorified, exalted. John says, I'll do whatever God asks me to do. And that, in fact, John literally said, if it means my life. Because John wasn't hesitant to say whatever. He had been told to be bold. And John's boldness was not just in the sackcloth, in the presentation of himself in the wilderness, the locust and the wild honey and his brash voice. It was him walking in to the house of an individual who was in great power and say, you're living in a way that is inappropriate and you need to know it. And he ends up being thrown into prison and losing his life. And while he's in prison, I don't see any. I understand why from prison he sends his disciples to Jesus and says, make sure he's the one. I want to know that my life is not in vain. That the risk that I took was worth it. Because that brings us to his last statement, the one he literally says, he must increase, but I must decrease. He's willing to become less for Jesus. Do you see what I meant when I said we need to look at a fellow who got it? Hebrews 11, if you'll read with me, is it's the list of folks that aren't mentioned by faith the same way that Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Sarah and Deborah. In verse 35, he just starts mentioning a group of individuals. Really starts back up in verse 32. And what more shall I say? For time would fail me to say of Gideon, of Barak, of Samson, of Jephthah, of David, of Samuel, and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, enforced justice, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the sword, were made strong out of weakness, became mighty in war, put foreign enemies to flight. Women received their dead back from resurrection. Some were tortured, refusing to accept release so that they might rise again to a better life. Others suffered mocking and flogging and even chains and imprisonment. They were stoned, sawn in two, killed by the sword. They went about in skins of sheep and goats, destitute, afflicted, mistreated, of whom the world was not worthy, wandering about in deserts and mountains and in dens and caves of the earth. They were willing to be less for Jesus. What am I willing to do without for God? How much, when I start that phrase, normally our response is, how much will I get? How much will I receive? What's in it? John says, I'm in it for Him. It's the transition. There is a story told in I think it's in the late 70s. A late afternoon in Korea, a missionary doctor emerged from the operating room, tired, beads of perspiration on his forehead. His hands trembled with fatigue. He was asked by an onlooker how much he would have received if such a delicate operation was performed in America. He said, perhaps $2,000. Remember, this is late 70s. But then came the question, how much you received from this Korean woman? The doctor hesitated and then replied, nothing but her gratitude and the master's smile. What do we need to be satisfied? John said, to see Jesus where He's supposed to be, doing what He came to do. Is that enough for us? Do we live our lives in such a way, say, it's not about me, it's about Him. God, let me do for Him what will draw attention His way. Kind of concluded last week with that moment of the serpent being lifted up and the Son of Man being lifted up, and that's what John got. He said, when He comes, I want to fade into the background. I don't want to be seen anymore because I want people to see Jesus. I hope for maybe a moment this morning you've seen what John saw. And you're ready, if that's necessary, for that to make a difference in your life. For you to do what John did when he submitted to God from the get-go and said, whatever I need to do, that's what I'll do for Jesus. It may be penitent faith, confession, and baptism this morning, the initial method of God, how He decided for us to submit ourselves and to be transformed, at least the initial birth process, into His image. There may be something else going on in your life, some struggle that's in the way of you submitting to God. There may be some concern on your heart that you need to share. We have this moment. We're going to sing this song to give you that opportunity to come at this time in any way we can help you. If you'll stand.